September 15, 1963, Birmingham, Alabama. A Sunday morning like any other, except this one would shatter the conscience of a nation and change the course of American history forever. It's just before 10:30 in the morning, inside the 16th Street Baptist Church, the largest black congregation in Birmingham. About 200 people are preparing for the 11 o'clock service. It's Youth Day, a special occasion when children participate in the adult worship service. The excitement is palpable. In the basement ladies' room, 5 young girls are getting ready, adjusting their dresses, fixing their hair, chattering about the new school year that just started days ago. They're dressed in their Sunday best, their voices echoing off the bathroom tiles as they help each other with sashes and ribbons. Their names are Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, Denise McNair, and Addie's younger sister, Sarah Collins. They're just kids. The oldest are 14. The youngest is 11. They have homework assignments to finish, favorite songs on the radio, dreams about what they'll be when they grow up. Cynthia excels at math. Carol is a straight-A student who loves to dance. Addie has a natural talent for art. Denise writes plays for the neighborhood children to perform. But in 1963, Birmingham, being black and having dreams, was a dangerous combination. To understand what happened that morning, you need to understand where it happened. Birmingham wasn't just another southern city struggling with race relations. It was ground zero for the most brutal, most violent resistance to civil rights in America. Between 1947 and 1963, over 50 unsolved bombings had torn through black homes and churches in Birmingham. 50. That's why locals had a nickname for their own city, a nickname that turned their home into a punchline of terror: Birmingham. Think about that for a second. So many bombs went off in black neighborhoods that people started calling it Birmingham, like it was normal, like explosions were just another part of daily life. One neighborhood experienced so many attacks that residents called it Dynamite Hill. Black families would go to bed not knowing if they'd wake up to the sound of an explosion. Children learned to recognize the sound of a blast before they learned their multiplication tables. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic terrorism, orchestrated by the most violent chapters of the Ku Klux Klan in the entire South, with the tacit approval and sometimes active participation of local law enforcement. Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety was a man named Eugene Bull Connor, and if there was a face of segregationist brutality in 1963, it was his. Connor controlled the police and fire departments, and he wielded that power like a weapon against anyone who dared challenge the racial order. But Birmingham's black community wasn't backing down. In fact, they were doing the opposite. They were organizing. They were protesting. They were demanding their rights. And that's exactly why the violence was escalating. The spring of 1963 had seen Birmingham become the focal point of the entire civil rights movement. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference launched what they called Project C for confrontation. The campaign included sit-ins, marches, and boycotts designed to bring down Birmingham's segregation system. King and local activist Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth knew they were walking into the lion's den. King later called Birmingham the most segregated city in America. This wasn't hyperbole. The city's 350,000 residents, 40% of them black, lived in completely separate worlds. There were no black police officers, no black firefighters, no black bank tellers or store clerks in white businesses. Black secretaries couldn't work for white professionals. The jobs available to black workers were limited to manual labor in the steel mills, domestic service, or work confined to black neighborhoods. But it wasn't just economic discrimination. It was total segregation of every aspect of public life. Water fountains, restrooms, schools, libraries, parks, even elevators were separated by race. And the system was enforced not just by law, but by violence. Then came the Children's Crusade. From May 2nd to May 10th, 1963, thousands of black students, some as young as 8 years old, marched from the 16th Street Baptist Church toward downtown Birmingham. The church served as their staging ground, their meeting place, their sanctuary, and Bull Connor met them with dogs and fire hoses. The images that came out of Birmingham that week shocked the world. Peaceful children being attacked by German shepherds, teenagers being blasted off their feet by water pressure so high it could peel the skin off a person's body. The footage played on television screens across America and around the globe. For the first time, many white Americans who'd been comfortable ignoring the civil rights movement couldn't look away. By May 10th, an agreement was reached. Birmingham's business leaders agreed to desegregate lunch counters, restrooms, and drinking fountains, and to hire black workers in stores. It was a victory, but it came at a cost, and white supremacists in Birmingham were furious. The bombings escalated. On May 11th, the Gaston Motel where King had been staying was bombed. In August, the home of NAACP attorney Arthur Shores was firebombed, not once, but twice. Governor George Wallace, who'd famously declared segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever at his inauguration, was doing everything in his power to block school integration. On September 9th, President Kennedy had to take control of the Alabama National Guard to force Wallace to stop blocking black students from entering public schools. The Klan was losing ground, and they knew it. Federal courts were ordering integration. The national mood was shifting, and they were desperate to strike back, to send a message to terrorize the black community into submission. The 16th Street Baptist Church was the perfect target. It wasn't just any church. It was everybody's church, a cornerstone of Birmingham's black community for decades. The church had hosted speeches by W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary McLeod Bethune, Paul Robeson, and Ralph Bunche. It served not just as a place of worship, but as a community center, a meeting hall, a symbol of black resilience and organization. Most importantly, it was the launching point for the spring demonstrations. The Children's Crusade had started there. Civil rights meetings were held there. Martin Luther King Jr. had preached from its pulpit. For white supremacists, the 16th Street Baptist Church represented everything they hated and feared: black people organizing, demanding rights, refusing to accept second-class citizenship, and they wanted to destroy it. Robert Edward Chambliss, known around town as Dynamite Bob for his love of explosives, had been making threats. Just days before the bombing, he told his niece, "Just wait until Sunday morning and they'll beg us to let them segregate." Think about that statement. He was planning to commit an act so horrific, so unthinkable, that it would somehow reverse the tide of history. He actually believed that murdering people in a church would make black Americans give up their fight for equality. In the early morning hours of September 15th, Chambliss and 3 other members of a Klan splinter group called the Cahaba Boys, Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr., Bobby Frank Cherry, and Herman Frank Cash, approached the church. They planted at least 15 sticks of dynamite beneath the steps on the east side of the building near the basement. They attached a timing device. Then they left. Inside the church, the congregation was gathering. People were greeting each other, catching up on the week's news, settling into Sunday school classes. Down in the basement, those 5 girls were almost finished getting ready. In just a few minutes, they'd head upstairs to take their place in the service. At 10:22 in the morning, the bomb detonated. The explosion was massive. It blew a hole through the church's east wall. Mortar and bricks sprayed like shrapnel. The blast caved in the basement walls and sent debris flying through the sanctuary. The sound could be heard for blocks. The force of the explosion shattered every window in the church except one. It even blew out the windows of buildings across the street. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the screams. Parishioners stumbled out of the building, their clothes torn, faces bleeding, bodies covered in white dust and shattered stained glass. Some helped others to safety. Some stood in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Parents who'd been upstairs frantically searched for their children. The smoke was so thick, people could barely see. The basement was almost completely destroyed. Emergency responders arrived to find a scene of devastation. More than 20 people were injured, some severely. But the worst news was still coming. Rescue workers began digging through the rubble in the basement ladies' room. That's where they found the bodies. Addie Mae Collins, 14 years old, Cynthia Wesley, 14 years old, Carol Robertson, 14 years old, Denise McNair, 11 years old. All 4 had been killed instantly when the wall collapsed on top of them. Sarah Collins, Addie Mae's 10-year-old sister, was pulled from the rubble alive, but she'd lost her right eye. She would spend months in the hospital and live the rest of her life with glass fragments embedded in her body and face. Painful reminders of that morning. Years later, she recalled the last moment before the blast. "I remember Denise asking Addie to tie her belt," she said. And then it happened. 4 little girls, dead, murdered while getting ready for Sunday school. The news spread through Birmingham like wildfire. By midday, thousands of black residents had gathered at the church. The grief was overwhelming, but so was the rage. For years, they'd endured bombing after bombing with no arrests, no justice. And now this, children, in a church, on a Sunday morning. Martin Luther King Jr. sent a telegram to Governor Wallace that cut right to the heart of the matter. "The blood of our little children is on your hands. Your irresponsible and misguided actions have created in Birmingham and Alabama the atmosphere that has induced continued violence and now murder." Wallace, for his part, offered a $5,000 reward for information about the bombers. The city added $52,000. But the gesture rang hollow. This was, after all, the same governor who'd told the New York Times just a week earlier that Alabama needed a few first-class funerals to stop racial integration. He'd gotten his wish. When Wallace sent state troopers to break up the crowds gathering at the church, violence erupted across the city. 2 more black teenagers were killed that day. 16-year-old Johnny Robinson was shot by police. 13-year-old Virgil Ware was gunned down by white youths. In total, 6 black children and teenagers died in Birmingham on September 15, 1963. But history remembers the 4 girls in the church, and for good reason. Their deaths in a house of God on a Sunday morning while preparing for worship was a brutality so pure, so senseless, that it could not be rationalized away or ignored. The funeral was held on September 18th. More than 8,000 people attended. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke at the service for 3 of the girls. The 4th girl's family held a smaller, private service. King addressed not just the mourners, but the nation. These children, unoffended, innocent and beautiful, were the victims of one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The FBI launched an immediate investigation. Within days, they'd identified the bombers. By May 13, 1965, less than 2 years after the attack, FBI agents had formally named the 4 perpetrators in a memo to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, Robert Chambliss, Thomas Blanton, Bobby Cherry, and Herman Cash. The evidence was solid. Witness statements placed them at the scene. FBI informants had recorded conversations where the suspects discussed the bombing. The Bureau had enough to prosecute, but Hoover said no. Let that sink in. The FBI knew who murdered 4 children in a church bombing, and the director refused to allow prosecutions. He blocked federal charges. He refused to share evidence with state prosecutors. In 1968, he officially closed the investigation and ordered all the files sealed. For decades, the evidence sat in boxes, gathering dust, while the bombers walked free. Why would Hoover do this? Historians have debated this question for years. Some point to Hoover's well-documented racism and his hostility toward the civil rights movement. He considered Martin Luther King Jr. a threat to national security and devoted FBI resources to surveilling and attempting to discredit him. Others suggest that Hoover feared a trial would expose FBI informants within the Klan, informants who may have had advanced knowledge of the bombing and failed to prevent it. Still others believe Hoover simply didn't think he could get convictions from all-white Alabama juries in the 1960s. Whatever his reasons, the result was the same: no justice for Addie Mae, Cynthia, Carol, and Denise, no justice for their families, no accountability for domestic terrorism. But the story didn't end there. The bombing became a turning point for the civil rights movement. If anything could awaken white America's conscience, it was the image of 4 girls murdered in Sunday school. Newspapers across the country condemned the attack. International outrage poured in. The bombing galvanized support for civil rights legislation that had been stalled in Congress. President Kennedy had already introduced a civil rights bill in June 1963, but it faced fierce opposition from Southern senators. After the bombing, the national mood shifted. When Kennedy was assassinated in November, just 2 months after the Birmingham bombing, the grief and momentum came together. President Lyndon Johnson pushed the Civil Rights Act through Congress, and on July 2, 1964, it became law. The act prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in employment and public accommodations. It was the most significant civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. In a tragic irony, the bombers achieved the exact opposite of what they intended. They wanted to terrorize Black Americans into submission, to stop the movement. Instead, they became the catalyst for its greatest legislative victory. But what about justice for the 4 girls? In 1971, a new Alabama Attorney General named William Bill Baxley took office. Baxley was young, white, and from Alabama. But he was different. He believed in justice, and he was determined to reopen the church bombing case. For 5 years, he fought to gain access to the FBI's sealed files. Hoover refused. It wasn't until 1975, 3 years after Hoover's death, that Baxley finally got some of the files by enlisting a reporter from the Los Angeles Times to threaten a story about the FBI's obstruction. With that evidence, Baxley prosecuted Robert Chambliss. In November 1977, 14 years after the bombing, Chambliss was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He died in prison in 1985, still proclaiming his innocence. One bomber, one conviction. It was something, but it wasn't enough. The case went cold again. Herman Cash died in 1994, having never been prosecuted. But in the mid-1990s, the FBI reopened the investigation as part of a coordinated effort to pursue cold cases from the civil rights era. When agents unsealed 9,000 pieces of evidence that had been hidden since the 1960s, they found something remarkable: audio recordings. The FBI had planted listening devices in Thomas Blanton's home after the bombing. On these scratchy, decades-old tapes, Blanton could be heard discussing the bombing with his wife. In one chilling exchange, his wife asked him what he went to the river for. "The meeting where we planned the bomb," Blanton replied. "We had to have a meeting to make the bomb." In another tape, Bobby Cherry's own granddaughter told investigators that Cherry openly bragged about the bombing at family reunions. "You ought to hear what he talks about," she said. In 2001, Thomas Blanton was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. In 2002, Bobby Cherry was convicted and also sentenced to life. Cherry died in prison in 2004. Blanton died in prison in 2020. Nearly 40 years after the bombing, 3 of the 4 men responsible had finally been held accountable. The prosecutor who secured those final convictions was Doug Jones, a U.S. attorney who would later become a U.S. Senator from Alabama. Jones had been just a boy when the bombing happened, but bringing the bombers to justice became one of the defining achievements of his career. The convictions weren't just about punishing 3 elderly men. They were about declaring unequivocally that these crimes mattered, that these girls mattered, that justice could still prevail even decades late. Today, the 16th Street Baptist Church still stands in Birmingham. It's a National Historic Landmark now, restored and active. Visitors from around the world come to pay their respects. In the basement, where the bomb exploded, there's a memorial to the 4 girls. Outside, sculptures commemorate their memory. In 2013, on the 50th anniversary of the bombing, President Barack Obama awarded posthumous Congressional Gold Medals to Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair. But perhaps the most powerful memorial is the one that exists in the American conscience. The 16th Street Baptist Church bombing forced America to confront the reality of racial terrorism. It stripped away any pretense that segregation was peaceful or that resistance to civil rights was somehow reasonable. You cannot bomb a church full of children and claim moral authority. You cannot murder 11-year-old girls and then argue you're defending civilization. Sarah Collins Rudolph, the survivor who lost her eye that day, has spent her life telling her story. She speaks to schools, churches, anyone who will listen. "I tell people about it so they won't forget," she says, "so they'll know what happened, so they'll understand what we went through. And what did we go through? What does the Birmingham bombing teach us?" It teaches us that terrorism isn't just something that happens in other countries or in other eras. It happened here, in America, in a church, to children. It teaches us that the fight for civil rights wasn't just about abstract principles or legal arguments. People died. Children died. They died because they were black in a time and place where that was considered justification enough for murder. It teaches us that justice delayed is not justice denied if we refuse to give up. It took 14 years to convict the first bomber, 38 years to convict the last. But those convictions mattered. They sent a message that even decades later, even when everyone expects the past to stay buried, the truth can emerge and justice can prevail. And it teaches us something else, something perhaps harder to accept, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary evil. Robert Chambliss, Thomas Blanton, Bobby Cherry, Herman Cash, they weren't cartoon villains. They were regular guys. They had families, jobs, friends. They went to church themselves. They genuinely believed they were defending their way of life, protecting their community. And that belief led them to plant a bomb in a basement where they knew children would be. That's the real horror. Not that monsters exist, but that ordinary people can become monsters when hate and fear take root. Birmingham in 1963 wasn't experiencing a sudden outbreak of evil. It was the culmination of decades of rhetoric that dehumanized Black Americans, that portrayed integration as an existential threat, that normalized violence as a tool of social control. Governor Wallace's segregation forever speech, Bull Connor's dogs and fire hoses, the 50 unsolved bombings that came before September 15th, all of it created an atmosphere where murdering children in a church could seem, to some, like a justifiable act of resistance. But here's what the bombers didn't count on: the resilience of the human spirit. They thought they could terrorize Black Americans into giving up. Instead, they inspired a movement. They thought they could preserve segregation forever. Instead, they helped destroy it. They thought they could kill the dream. Instead, they made martyrs of 4 innocent girls whose memory continues to challenge America to live up to its ideals. Addie Mae Collins wanted to be an artist. Cynthia Wesley dreamed of becoming a teacher. Carol Robertson was thinking about college. Denise McNair was just 11 years old, still figuring out what she wanted to be. They never got the chance to find out, but their deaths meant something. They meant that America could no longer look away. They meant that the cost of injustice became too high to ignore. Every year on September 15th, people gather at the 16th Street Baptist Church to remember. They read the names. They ring the bells. They pledge to continue the work that those 4 girls died for, the work of justice, of equality, of human dignity. Because that's the final lesson of Birmingham: the work isn't finished. Racial terrorism may look different today than it did in 1963, but the struggle for equal rights continues. The legacy of Addie Mae, Cynthia, Carol, and Denise isn't just a history lesson, it's a call to action. It's a reminder that progress requires sacrifice, that justice requires courage, that freedom isn't free. On the morning of September 15, 1963, 5 girls walked into a church basement to get ready for Sunday school. 4 of them never walked out. Their names are carved in stone at memorials across the country. Their story is taught in schools. Their sacrifice changed America. But the question they left us with remains: what are we willing to do to ensure that no more children die because of the color of their skin? How will we honor their memory? What kind of country will we build on the foundation of their sacrifice? Those are the questions that still echo from the basement of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And the answer is up to us. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.